Welcome, PBC kids. We will say hi to our friends at home. Hi, guys. Hi. Okay. So, what a journey the Israelites are having. They have experienced so many miracles performed by God to show that He cares for them. In our lesson last week, we learned about specific instructions that God gave on building a specific thing. Can somebody remember the name of that building that God told them how to build? Does anybody remember what we learned about last week? It's a really big word, starts with a T. Hold on. Put your feet on the floor, please. Okay, Luke, what did we learn about last week? The tabernacle. We learned about the tabernacle and the specific instructions God gave for them to build it in the wilderness. God showed the Israelites through the items in the tabernacle how He is holy and how they were to worship Him. So today, we jump from the book of Exodus to Numbers in the Old Testament to find out how some of the Israelites trusted in God and how some didn't trust in Him because they feared men and made wrong choices. So we know how God freed the Israelites from slavery in Egypt, right? God sent plagues so that Pharaoh would release the Israelites, right? And those they wanted to be released so that they could worship God freely. They weren't allowed to do that in Egypt. So God performed those miracles to free them. But where was God leading His people to? Can somebody remember why they're roaming around in the wilderness? Where is God leading them? Do you remember, Luke? Close. It is the Holy Land, but it's called the Promised Land. God gave them a specific piece of land, and He was leading them towards it. It was a wonderful land that He promised to them. The Israelites were not always happy or thankful towards God, though. They spent a lot of time grumbling and complaining to God because He freed them from slavery. Isn't that silly? People were complaining as they were being led by God through the pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire. How could they complain when God had freed them and showed them over and over and over and over again that He cared for them and He provided for their needs? But they still complained. Even though they complained, God still led them and took care of them. God always keeps His promises. That's our first line up here. God always keeps His promises. And He was leading them to the land of Canaan, which is the promised land. God told Moses to choose one leader from each of the 12 tribes. These 12 men were to go into Canaan to spy on the land. And we have a little picture down here that I made that shows us kind of what Canaan could look like. So these 12 guys are going to go in and spy on the land. The 12 men set out to see what the land was like and to see if the people who lived there were strong or weak, if the land was good or bad, if there were big cities, and if the land had good fruits and trees. The point of them spying was to encourage the Israelites and let them know the land was really good. It took the men 40 days to spy and come back. The 12 men came back to Moses and all the Israelites and told them what they saw. They all agreed that the land was really good. That looks like a really good land down there, doesn't it? It's real green. Listen. They all agreed the land was really good, just as God said it would be. The land produced good food for the people to eat and live on. They even brought back some of the fruits from Canaan to show everyone. So in our world, in our day today, a bunch of grapes looks like this, right? They're not real, they're fake, but they're a really good example. So it's a nice sized bunch of grapes, really pretty. But the guys from the spies, when they came back from Canaan, the Bible tells us that they brought a branch with a single, wrong way. So they brought a branch with a single cluster of grapes on it. And that single cluster of grapes was so big that 2 guys had to carry it on a branch between them. Isn't that crazy? Wow. That is one cluster of grapes. That's almost as big as these guys, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Go ahead, Luke.
To make it easier, wouldn't it be easier if one of us was your helper? Put the...
Nope, I've got it completely under control. But the cluster of grapes was so big that 2 men had to help carry it. That's a big cluster of grapes. We don't have grapes that big around here. Yeah. The spies also reported that there were large protected cities, which you can see down there, and big, strong people who lived there. And I have a couple guys here that are going to be our big, strong people. So they saw big, strong people, and I think I got one guy taller than the other. That's okay. Although the spies all agreed that the land was good, there was a disagreement among the spies about if the Israelites should move into the land or not. So 10 out of the 12 men reported back to Moses with a bad report. Do you have a question? It does kind of look like that, but that's the city that we use for all of our city illustrations. So we're going to pretend that it looks like Canaan. So 10 of the 12 men reported back with a bad report. They told everyone that the land was much too big, and the people who currently lived there were too tall and strong, and the Israelites shouldn't take the land from them. They even exaggerated the story of how big the men in the land were. They said that the people were practically giants, and the Israelites would be like grasshoppers compared to them. So they would be teeny tiny. So, got a cat hair on there. Teeny tiny compared to the people of the land of Canaan. The spies were fearful of the people and not trusting God to do what he promised he would do. We see our second line here said God wants us to trust him. But 2 of the men had a different report. They were Caleb and Joshua, and they said, it might look scary, but we can take the land with God's help because God said that he's giving that land to us. Caleb and Joshua looked beyond what their eyes saw, and they trusted God to keep his promise. But you know what the Israelites did? They started crying and complaining. They cried and complained all night, saying that there is no way that they could take this land from the big, tall guys. They accused God of bringing them into the desert to watch them die. That's really sad. They even said again that they were better off in Egypt as slaves. Those Israelites, man. They thought it would be better to be slaves in an area where they couldn't even worship God freely. How quickly they forgot how God took care of them. They decided to choose a new leader and try to return to Egypt. It's not very good. Moses, Aaron, Caleb, and Joshua tried to reason with them. They tried to explain how God promised the land to them and that he would fulfill his promises. The Israelites were pretty stubborn and upset, though, and instead of listening, they decided to not trust God. God was not happy with them. He had shown them over and over in the desert that his people could trust him and follow his ways. But the Israelites did not learn their lesson. Once again, they chose not to follow God's way. Remember, we've learned many times the last few lessons that there are 2 ways of doing things, God's way or the wrong way. When we choose not to obey a God, there are consequences, and the Israelites are about to find out all about those consequences. God had been very gracious so far, but this time he had to let his people experience the consequence of their disobedience and their lack of trust in him. God told Moses that he was going to wipe out all the Israelites and just leave Moses and his family to enter the promised land. That's really scary, isn't it? Really sad. Took them all the way there, and they disobeyed, and they weren't going to be able to enter the promised land. But Moses pleaded with God to spare the Israelites. God listened to Moses and said that he would not kill them, but there would be big consequences for their disobedience. The consequence of disobeying God and grumbling against him was this: the 10 bad spies died immediately. Everyone who was 20 years old and older would die over the next 40 years in the desert, and none of them would be able to set their foot into the promised land. How sad is it to wander around the desert for 40 years? That's really sad, isn't it? When they know that if we had obeyed God, we could have been in that promised land right there. They were so close. They weren't supposed to wander the desert, but they didn't trust God and obey him. So God wants us to obey him. Now, what about the few who did make the right choice to trust and obey God? Can you guys remember the 2 spies' names that gave a good report? Do you remember what their names were?
I think one was Joshua.
Joshua was one name. What was the other name?
Caleb.
Caleb and Joshua. Good job. So Moses and Aaron, who were leading with God's help, and then Caleb and Joshua, they had obedient hearts, even though the rest of the people did not. God blessed them and their families for trusting and obeying him. God promised that they would enter the promised land. That's pretty nice, isn't it? So what do we learn from this story? We learn that God wants us to trust him And God wants us to obey him, even when the situation we get into appears to be a tough one. God wants us to stand up for him. He is trustworthy. In our first line here, God always keeps his promises. We can never go wrong for trusting God and obeying him, right? So it's really sad that the Israelites didn't get to go into the promised land. The majority of them didn't. But they disobeyed, and they disobeyed pretty big. Yeah.
Pretty badly.
Yeah, pretty badly. So the rest of the Israelites, after 40 years, got to go into the promised land, and we'll probably learn about that next week. So we're going to say goodbye to our friends at home. Thanks for being with us, guys. We miss you a lot, and we hope to see you soon. Goodbye.